All right, everybody, welcome back to Left Reckoning. We are joined by someone I'm very excited to talk to, Paul Bowers, who is a writer and an activist in South Carolina. He runs the really phenomenal Brutal South substack, which y'all should be checking out. And I'm really excited to be talking to him a bit about the political economy of South Carolina, the history, sort of understanding that state, because I think it's a state that a lot of people think they sort of know what it represents, but it's actually there's a lot going on beneath the surface, and also has a lot of power in the country. But thank you so much, Paul, for hanging out with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And Matt, I know you've got some South Carolina roots. You said you're a Myrtle Beach people.
Yeah, man. I went to high school in South Carolina. I was in like North Myrtle Beach, Loris area. I snuck into Myrtle Beach High School through a fake address. Actually, don't tell them. It's a little bit of a nicer school than the one around me. But yeah, no, I lived in South Carolina for a while. I mean, I really do love South Carolina. They were a little mean. They teased me a lot about my boots and buckles when I first came there from Texas. But I did very much. I do feel a soft spot for the state, and especially for the cooking and the food and the people. And I mean, we had a listener sort of suggest that I reach out to you, and I looked into your work, and I thought it was really phenomenal, because I do think, especially people on the left, they sort of have a hard time understanding what the state of South Carolina is, because undoubtedly it's a southern state. It has a deep history and a lot of the horrors in the South. But its modern day history is a little bit more complicated. I mean, it sort of runs this line between the state that played a really pivotal role in American history, to now having being a major like tourist state, for example, right? Like, it sells a fantasy of itself.
Definitely.
But I think a lot of people who aren't there don't realize the major industries and things like that that move there. Anyways, I don't want to preload it too much. I mean, I'm curious if you were to sort of talk to somebody, maybe a leftist, and sort of give them a quick flavor of what South Carolina is. I know it's a big topic. How would you start that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our political economy, I kind of had to relearn that as an adult, because we judiciously avoided a lot of that in our sort of South Carolina history courses growing up, and but there's a lot there. It was. I think a lot of people are familiar with the early history of this place, and that it was a plantation economy. It was one of the major ports of entry for the transatlantic slave trade. Charleston in particular was a grotesquely wealthy city built on human misery. So that is our origin as a state. That's the political power here historically has been in and around Charleston. Gadsden's Wharf, where we brought people in chains here, and that. That was our foundation. That was where the wealth came from. But then, like all throughout our history, there has been this thread of sort of radical possibility. Especially, again, in the earliest days, there were times when it was a plantation state, but the majority of the population here was African American. And there was always the possibility of revolt and revolution. And a few attempts were made, the Stono Rebellion, Denmark Vesey's attempt. And I mean, some successes, one thing that even a lot of South Carolina people don't know is that Harriet Tubman led a raid on a plantation down on Cumbie Ferry, and led Union ships up the river, laid siege to this place, burned the plantations to the ground, and liberated people. And that is as much, if not more, our heritage as a state than the sort of gone with the wind, horse-drawn carriage tour bullshit that we sell as a tourist economy. So I don't know. That's my like early history, but like all throughout we after agriculture, after sort of the collapse of Reconstruction, we were a textile-based economy. We had a lot of textile mills here. There were attempts to unionize there that were brutally repressed, including at Honea Path. And then this is like super fast gloss of history, but today, as you said earlier, like we do have a really really powerful tourism industry, especially in cities like Charleston, Myrtle Beach. I mean, this is where people come to go on vacation or have their, bachelor and bachelorette party or have a wedding. I'm forgive my low country bias here. Upstate people will yell at me, but like so much of that here is based in our earliest sin and our earliest myth as this sort of sweet, romantic, warm, fuzzy plantation. People still have weddings on plantations, and it's grotesque. It's like having a wedding at a concentration camp.
For sure.
So I don't know. That's here locally, the tourism industry, the wedding industry, that's a big thing. And agriculture is still a big part of our economy here. We grow more peaches than Georgia. We're pretty proud of that.
Yeah, that's an important point, and I knew you were going to bring that up.
Yep, that's a sticking point, man. Yeah.
The reason that, for people who aren't familiar, the reason is Georgia's just not that interesting of a place that they sort of, the only thing they could think of was peaches. South Carolina has history, so they're able to have a better nickname. Yeah. So agriculture is still here, and a lot of that depends on migrant labor. And then we do still have some manufacturing industry here, but the way, or I guess the reason that manufacturing sets up base here is it's cheap. We're cheap workers who have been rendered docile. And that's the anti-union.
Yep. We consistently rank either 49th or 50th in union density in the state. Last few years we've been 50th. It ranks around like 2 or 3% of the state. 2 or 3% of workers are represented by a union in the state. So you can go your entire life without knowing a single person who joined a union.
No, I mean that was my experience, working there. I did concrete work for a while, in the Grand Strand, and it was not unionized at all. But before we get too contemporary, I just wanted to add a couple quick points to, reckoning with and sort of wrestling with the history. I like the point that I make this point a lot about Texas and frankly about the U.S. too, is that we have to write in radicals into our history, and to realize that with all of the victories of reactionary forces in our history, there were people doing something else, right? And it is to our opponent's advantage to sort of tie everybody in with, their kind of power and privilege, right? Because the thing that's sort of different, for example, about North Carolina and South Carolina is South Carolina was one of the most powerful and wealthy parts of the country during slavery, and the families that benefited from slavery continued that power post slavery. But for the average person, average worker, it was tough. It was a poor state for most, kind of wage laborers for most of its history. And it's fascinating to see that the wealth disparity is so strong that when you do meet wealthy families in South Carolina, they do tend to have that direct connection to owning people, 150 years ago, right? That wealth was so immense that it maintains its power 150 years later. And I don't know. Yeah. I think it's important to see those ruling classes as a continuation rather than, I don't know, disappearing into the woodwork, right? They maintained the property and they owned the land and they were able to utilize that even after Reconstruction.
Yeah, and our billionaires tend to be new money, but there are still old families, and you hear certain names and where their money came from. The biggest newspaper in the state is owned by the Manigault family, who were they built their wealth on a plantation and on the slave trade, and were even within a brutal industry considered especially brutal.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, it's dark. It's dark to to think of it. No, I mean, and I think it's really important to recognize that too, just because like the right really plays into the whole lost cause mythology, and it's such a big part of the tourism industry, as we were talking about, with the plantation weddings. And I like Charleston a lot. Charleston is a really wonderful town, but there's certainly parts of Charleston that play into that kind of aristocrat. They don't mention it, but like, what's the fantasy here, right?
Right.
It's being on top of a brutal system, right? And I think it's important to be able to situate yourself within a place, and then also situate yourself within a kind of radical history, so that we can be better prepared to fight back against these kind of reactionary tellings that we're so inundated with.
Yeah.
Can I just speak to that inundation? Because as a North Dakotan, my impressions of South Dakota, I mean, obviously the first was sports. But I know somebody who went to South Dakota as part of like a they're in sales, and won like a certain amount hit a quota for sales and got to go to like the corporate retreat, right? And it was in South Carolina, and like three takeaways from that came, and the first one was they got to go to the BMW plant and whip around the track with the test track,
a
test track with a professional driver, and then be super impressed, and then like go home wanting a BMW. They also got to drive to the Vanderbilt mansion, so like this glorified oligarchy. And then you also have like you mentioned, like the plantation tourism. It's like not ideologically not the best like sort of itinerary, I guess. So maybe we need to update that a little bit.
That is a whirlwind adventure, man. so much.
Yeah, I mean, and the upstate is wild too. I mean, it's such a fascinating, different culture.
Is it a coastal, like inland dynamic?
So upstate, and correct, I'm pretty sure I'm not too rusty on this, but upstate is like, you have to think like, so like low country is like the eastern part of the state. And you literally just think about it, instead of thinking up like north-south, you're thinking about elevation, right? So as you get closer to the Appalachian Mountains, right, the land gets higher, so it's the upstate. And like that history is very different than like, the low country, which like, apart from places like Myrtle Beach, which really are like only existed like 1955 plus, right? A lot of those towns are really, really old. They're old, communities in the South. The upstate, a lot of that was, later, in American history that really started to get developed. So you have sort of, you have super old towns, you have railroad towns, so you can go through those towns. I've gone through the entire boom and bust cycle. But yeah, it's like, it's not a different state, I wouldn't say, but it's a very different history. There's a distinct identity, I think, between low country and upstate folks.
Definitely. Yeah. There's some pretty fine cultural distinctions too. This is maybe a little too church niche for some people, but like, upstate tends to be more Baptist. The low country is a little more genteel. The base of power is more in the Episcopalian kind of tradition, I guess.
I remember that.
And like, I mean, the upstate is where, Bob Jones University is up there. I mean, it is still a stronghold for cultural conservatism. And that's distinct, I think, in some ways from more secular libertarianism. And so, sometimes there are really interesting fights you can sort of observe between the cultural conservatives and the strictly economic libertarians in the state. I'm not picking a side there. I don't have a dog in that fight, but they have those fights. I mean, it comes across in the weirdest ways, like, the fight to take down the Confederate flag from the State House grounds. The state legislators who voted to keep it, nearly all were from the upstate.
That is fascinating.
Right. Despite that not being the place where the place that had a stake in the Civil War, the farmers there tended to be poorer, tenant farmers, the something about the cultural politics is different there, and it still holds a lot of sway.
I mean, honestly, that might be an episode in and of itself to sort of deal with lost cause mythology, because like the way that it sort of permeates the culture is actually really fascinating and baffling.
Yeah.
But before, I want to get into the politics a little bit, but before we get too far, I do just like, for people who are unfamiliar, I want to introduce them. We talked for a second about BMW, but also Boeing. There are high-profile companies that are moving to South Carolina for labor itself, and primarily the promise is to get non-union workers. To sort of, I mean, I remember when Boeing moved to South Carolina, it was a big deal because. I mean, not only was it a big deal for people in South Carolina because people were excited about the opportunity of jobs and a big company moving there, but in the national media, it was very much a union battle, right? They were moving there to get away from a unionized workforce. And I mean, my history might be off here, but these big moves that happened to South Carolina also coincided with an expansion across the South of big manufacturing. Actually moving to like places like Tennessee and northern Georgia to get around the high unionization rate. So, while we're looking at the entire history of the state, I think that it's worth noting, on top of the tourism and all these other things, that there is a function for, the big international, like bourgeoisie, the big international corporations to try to use places like South Carolina as, spots to find unorganized labor, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think the BMW move was a little bit before my time, but I definitely followed the Boeing fight closely, because that's right in my backyard. I'm in North Charleston, and I mean the place they built their plant is in North Charleston, right by the airport and the Air Force Base. And I mean, you're right. Yeah, it was Boeing was looking for a new place to manufacture the Dreamliner, which is sort of its latest passenger jet at the time, and their base at the time was in Everett, Washington, outside Seattle, which was unionized. And so unsubtly, they picked their new location in the most anti-union state in the country. The union pointed this out to the NLRB, kind of went nowhere. They got a settlement that came of it, and Boeing came here. And it is to this day something that politicians will toot their horn about and say, like, well, I helped bring Boeing here. Like our mayor still brags about this. He has like a little model of a Boeing plane on his desk, and Nikki Haley still likes to brag about it. And the sales pitch was so transparent. It was, the labor is cheap here, and the people won't have any power to push back. Which is great if you're trying to protect your profit margins, but it has effects for all of us in and outside of the state. One good thing about mechanics unions is that they enable workers to push back on safety issues in manufacturing, and quality control. When your workforce is not unionized and you are a mechanic with the knowledge to know that something is going wrong, you're more hesitant to raise your voice. And Boeing has had serious issues with plane safety in the last few years. And it does not bode well that they are pushing more and more manufacturing to places like this, where workers are afraid to speak up.
Yeah, I mean, it's like almost like internal globalization in the U.S., right? Where they use globalization to push wages down internationally, and now it's sort of coming back home to roost. Well, I wanted to get a little bit to the politics, and we're going to get to Nikki Haley a little bit more in depth in a second, but I want to ask you this question. I don't have a particular answer to it, so I'm just curious what your thoughts are on it. I do feel like South Carolina has a very large influence on our national politics, certainly historically. But I think surprisingly so, and I don't mean this as a dig against South Carolina, but even still today, for a state that, it's not a massive population. But I would hanger that most folks, would wager that most folks know more politicians from South Carolina, or at least senators from South Carolina, than they do North Carolina, for example. Like, why does South Carolina have such a large influence on national politics, do you think?
Yeah, it is interesting. And I guess I'm always interested in the ones that fly under the radar here. People like Mick Mulvaney, who's not a household name for a lot of people. He doesn't go on as many of the talk shows, but like, was one of the only people who stuck around for the entire Trump presidency. He was his OMB director and served like 3 different roles in the Trump White House. Just kind of quietly plugging along, doing terrible things, you know. But we do have like, there are people that, you know, are widely known outside the state, dating back to John C. Calhoun, who was our native son who upheld slavery as a positive good in the great debates of his time. But yeah, today I think, I don't know, there are a lot of factors, but I mean, one is that we hold the first primaries in the South. So we're always one of the first primary states, and you know, we end up being a turning point for a lot of elections, you know, on both sides. You know, South Carolina was a decisive victory for Trump, and it was a decisive victory for Biden in 2020. I mean, that South Carolina is where the Democratic establishment really hammered a nail into the Bernie campaign. And I don't know. I mean, it's hard to ascribe motivation, but I mean, the effect you can see is that on the Republican side, South Carolina serves as a barometer for where cultural conservatives will land. Yeah. So like the fact that evangelicals would hold their nose or even gleefully vote for a man like Donald Trump really opened the floodgates. You know, like, oh, if Christians are fine with this guy who is by any definition anti-Christ, then all bets are off, right? And then on the Democratic
side, I mean, when he was elected, I'm just saying that I remember talking to folks, and I was dead wrong about Trump. In 16, I remember telling people, like, you know, there's nothing that people there hate more than just like a Yankee billionaire.
Right, yeah.
You know, but I was dead wrong. I mean, like, he was able to break through it. So yeah, no, I think it isn't. You're right. That is an interesting barometer of how folks are feeling, what they're going to accept, even.
Right. Yeah, what they would tolerate or what they actually, it turns out, love. Well, and then I mean, on the Democratic side, I mean, it's a primary. Where the voters, especially if they're, you know, under 40 or 50 years of age, have only ever known defeat. You know, Republicans have held a trifecta of power in the state since the early 2000s. It's actually more recent than you would think, but, you know, the Southern strategy really kind of hit its stride here. Some of its earliest architects were from here, but yeah, we didn't fully transition away from Democratic control to Republican control until like 2002, 2003, I want to say. But I mean, yeah, I mean, for me, I'm 33 years old, you know, like I can spend my whole life voting for Democrats and seeing nothing come of it, you know.
It's just like a ritual.
Yeah, it's just like, yeah. It's you can do it cathartically, I suppose, but like, yeah, you're voting for people in the state house who maybe fight a few good fights, but practically always lose because they have no one to build coalition with. They have no path to power, and that's only going to be cemented through gerrymandering this year.
Yes, and I can't imagine how bad that's looking there, frankly. I mean, that, and then also, I mean, and this is across the South, it's like this kind of, there's a lot of migration that we're seeing all across the country, but that's going southward. But particularly this kind of bizarre suburban right-wing move to the South, right? You know, I'm in Austin, and like Austin's a city that really is struggling with that. All these people are like, oh, we need to come back to like the real America. I feel like a lot of like the angriest conservatives I knew when I was living in South Carolina were like from New Jersey and New York.
No, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
And what I'm saying is like you're importing like a reactionary voter base too, along with an entrenched power structure that is trying to gerrymander. I mean, it's very difficult task to break through. We got
still true in Myrtle Beach for sure, and Horry County.
I should speak about Charleston. Very different
more
cities.
More in Horry, like Hilton Head area too, and people retire there because the taxes are silly and cheap. And so you end up with people who came here to evade taxes. And I mean,
don't care about the schools, not that most Republicans do, but like they don't think about the kids as their kids, right?
Right.
I want to get to this Nikki Haley stuff, but I do just want to note one thing, because I was saying this to Matt beforehand, and I didn't realize people don't know this. Tim Scott, the South Carolina senator, and he has a lot of similarities actually to Nikki Haley, the way that the GOP sort of prompts them up as like, look, these are, people of color who are sort of with our program. And we're going to get to Nikki Haley in a second, but I want to remind people that Tim Scott really does represent a very particular kind of conservative version of politics, not only in like what he does as a senator, right? But what his life story is. And I was telling Matt this before, like the big thing that happened in his life is that, he grew up in a troubled home, but then he got a job at Chick-fil-A. And his manager at Chick-fil-A like showed him the right way. And there's something about that story to me that is just like, this is like, the pure mythology of a certain kind of South Carolina conservative, that it's only through, minimum wage labor, especially at Chick-fil-A, which also just just represents so much of a certain kind of culture. Like that was what was able to mold. It wasn't the school system. It wasn't the community. It was like cold, hard capitalism teaching him, the value of a dollar and to put away all those kind of bad habits that he had inherited from his family. I think that it's really important to recognize, and obviously I'm saying that tongue in cheek, that's not my beliefs, but that's the, there is something about Tim Scott that I think that people forget, that like, at least the way that he sort of presented or taught to people, very much does fit into a kind of, I don't know, narrative, ideological narrative. Yeah.
And I can understand the appeal of it. As a former Chick-fil-A fry cook myself, actually, Chick-fil-A is such a cipher for understanding a certain view of the world. Yeah.
There's only so much we could do with that. It's just funny enough to me that like, I think that most people don't realize that it's just, I don't know, it's just something that a dad would make up, frankly. Like the perfect political subject.
Well, exactly. It's perfect because it hits people right in the gut, because if one culture is pervasive in America, it's fast food culture. So you're like really on the best highway into people's hearts is talking about their fast food that they like.
Right.